The sun hung low over the Montana plains and Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the massive boulder that had rolled down from the hillside during last night's storm and blocked the only water access her cattle had to the creek below, and her hands were scraped raw from trying to move it and her shoulders ached with an exhaustion that went deeper than just physical labor. She was 58 years old and running this ranch alone since Thomas had passed 3 years ago, and some days the weight of it all pressed down on her like that boulder pressed into the dry earth, and today was one of those days. "Don't," she whispered to herself as tears started to blur her vision, "stop." But she couldn't stop because 20 head of cattle needed water and the creek was their only source in this drought, and if she couldn't move this rock by nightfall she'd have to drive them 2 miles north to Old Man Henderson's property and ask for help again, and the shame of that felt almost worse than the aching in her bones. She heard the sound of hooves before she saw him, and when she looked up with dirt streaking her face and sweat dampening her shirt, there was Jacob Torres dismounting from his Palomino mare. Jacob ran the neighboring property and she'd seen him maybe a dozen times in the 5 years he'd lived there, and each time had been brief and cordial in the way that Western neighbors understood boundaries and respected distance. He was somewhere in his early 60s, she guessed, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that rushing only led to mistakes. "Saw the dust from the road," he said quietly, and walked over without waiting for permission, figured the storm might have caused some trouble. Sarah wanted to tell him she had it handled, and she wanted to wave him away and protect what little pride she had left, but when she opened her mouth what came out was, "I can't move it." The admission hung in the air between them, and Jacob just nodded like she'd told him something simple about the weather, and he crouched down beside the boulder and ran his hands over its surface, studying it the way her Thomas used to study problems before solving them. "This one's been here a long time," he said, and she realized he wasn't talking about the boulder but about a depression in the ground nearby. "See that? This rock used to sit right there and probably been rolling down a few inches every big storm for the past 100 years, and last night it finally made its way here." Something about the way he said it made the boulder seem less like a catastrophe and more like just another part of the land's story. "I've got a winch in my truck," Jacob said, "and some chain, and if we can get the angle right we might be able to pull it aside enough for your cattle to get through." He didn't wait for her to accept her decline and just walked back to his horse and rode off toward his property, and Sarah sat there in the dirt feeling something she hadn't felt in a long while, and she couldn't quite name it, but it was warm and unfamiliar. When Jacob returned 20 minutes later he had a heavy-duty winch and thick chains and a thermos that he set down beside her and said, "Coffee and still hot, and you look like you could use some." They worked in a companionable silence, and Jacob never once made her feel incapable or weaken. Instead he asked her opinion on angles and leverage and listened when she suggested trying the north side first because the ground was more stable there. The sun dropped lower and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and twice they had to reset the chains, and once the winch slipped and nearly caught Jacob's hand, but he just stepped back and reset without complaint. "Don't," Sarah said when she saw him position himself at a dangerous angle, "stop." He paused and looked at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, an understanding maybe, and he adjusted his position and gave her a small nod that said he heard what she meant. When the boulder finally shifted it moved 6 inches and then a foot and then rolled enough to create a passage wide enough for cattle to pass through single file to reach the water, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. They stood there breathing hard and watching the first curious heifer approach the gap and test it before walking through to the creek below, and then the others followed, and the sound of them drinking was like music. "Thank you," Sarah said, and her voice cracked on the words, "I don't know what I would have done." Jacob was coiling his chains and he didn't look up when he said, "You would have figured something out, and you always do." The certainty in his voice startled her, because how could he know that about her when they barely knew each other? As if reading her thoughts he continued, "I've watched you run this place alone for 3 years now, and I've seen you fix fences in January, ice and birth calves in April, mud, and last summer when that grass fire started near your property line you had it contained before the volunteer department even arrived, and so yeah, and you would have figured it out." Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, and something that had been sealed tight since Thomas died, and it wasn't romantic or dramatic, and it was just the simple recognition of being seen by another human being. "Would you stay for dinner?" The words came out before she could think better of them. "It's not much, and just stew I made yesterday, and but I'd like to repay you somehow." Jacob secured the last chain on his horse and turned to look at her, and really look at her, and his eyes were kind in a way that made her throat tight. "I'd like that," he said simply. They rode back to her ranch house slowly, and Sarah on her bay gelding and Jacob on his palomino, and the evening air cooling around them. And when they reached the barn, Jacob helped her unsaddle both horses without being asked, and she noticed the way he ran his hands over her gelding's legs, checking for heat or swelling, and the gesture of someone who cared about animals beyond their utility. Inside the house, Sarah felt suddenly self-conscious about the worn furniture and the photos still covering every surface, and all of Thomas and their life together, and the way dust had settled into corners she kept meaning to clean. But Jacob didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it, and he washed his hands at the kitchen sink and asked where she kept her bowls and set the table while she heated the stew and sliced bread from the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. They ate in comfortable quiet at first, and the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, and then slowly Sarah started talking, and she told him about Thomas and about their 40 years together, and about how they'd bought this ranch as newlyweds with nothing but hope and stubbornness, and about the years of plenty and the years of drought, and about losing him to cancer that moved too fast for treatment or goodbyes. Jacob listened, and really listened, and not just waiting for his turn to talk but absorbing her words like they mattered, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I lost Maria 6 years ago," he said. "Heart attack, and she was in the garden 1 minute and planting tomatoes and gone the next, and I sold our place in Colorado because everywhere I looked I saw her absence, and I came here thinking distance would help, and it didn't, and not really, and but time did, and a little anyway." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and the gesture surprising them both, and but neither pulled away. "I'm 63 years old," Jacob continued, "and I thought I was done with connecting to people, and that Maria was my once in a lifetime, and maybe she wasn't, but I'm learning that the heart is bigger than we think, and that there's different kinds of love and different seasons for it." He turned his hand over so their palms touched, and his skin was rough and warm and familiar somehow. "I've been wanting to come check on you for months now," he admitted, "but I didn't want to intrude and didn't want you to think I had ulterior motives, and but seeing you today trying to move that boulder alone, and it reminded me that sometimes we need to risk looking foolish or forward if it means keeping someone from suffering alone." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, and not sad tears exactly, but something more complicated, and something like grief and gratitude and possibility all mixed together. "I've been so lonely," she whispered, "and I didn't even realize how much until right now, and until someone was sitting across from me and really here." They talked until the stew went cold, and then Sarah heated it again, and they talked some more, and Jacob told her about his daughter in Denver and his 2 grandchildren he saw twice a year, and about learning to bake bread during his first year alone because Maria had always done it and he wanted to keep that ritual alive. Sarah told him about her son in Seattle, and about how he'd begged her to sell the ranch and move closer, but she couldn't leave this land that held 40 years of memories, and how sometimes she wondered if that made her stubborn or stupid. "It makes you faithful," Jacob said, "and to yourself and to what matters to you, and there's nothing stupid about that." When Jacob finally stood to leave, it was past 10 and later than either of them usually stayed up, and Sarah walked him to the door, and they stood on the porch under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "I'd like to do this again," Jacob said, "and if you're amenable, and maybe next time I could cook for you and I make a decent pot roast." Sarah smiled, and really smiled for the first time in longer than she could remember, and said, "I'd like that very much." He mounted his horse and was about to turn toward home when he paused and looked back at her. "Sarah, and what you said today when I was moving that boulder, and when you told me don't stop, and I want you to know I heard it, and I heard you protecting me and looking out for me, and it's been a long time since anyone did that, and so thank you." She watched him ride away, and his silhouette growing smaller against the night until the darkness swallowed him completely, and she stood there feeling the cool air on her skin and listening to the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Inside, the house felt different somehow and less empty, and she washed their dishes and put away the leftover stew, and when she passed Thomas's photo on the mantel she touched it gently and whispered, "I think you'd like him, and I think you'd be glad I'm not alone anymore." That night Sarah slept better than she had in 3 years, and she dreamed of hands working together to move impossible things, and of tables set for 2, and of a voice saying you always figure it out with such certainty it became true. The next morning she found a jar of honey on her porch with a note in careful handwriting that said, "For your bread and from my bees, and see you Friday if that works." And Jacob. Sarah stood there holding the jar and feeling the sun warm on her face, and she thought about how kindness sometimes looks like understanding what someone means even when their words come out wrong, and how "don't stop" could mean keep going, and could mean I see you, and could mean you're not alone in this. She thought about how the things that break us open sometimes let light in, and how we're never too old to begin again, and how love isn't always lightning and sometimes it's just a neighbor with chains and a winch who shows up when you need him most. She thought about boulders that take 100 years to move, and about how maybe we're all just slowly rolling toward where we're meant to be, and how sometimes the obstacles aren't meant to stop us but to slow us down enough that we notice the person riding up with help. And she thought about Friday and about pot roast and about the way Jacob listened like her words were important, and about the possibility that at 58 she might still have chapters left to write. The cattle drank from the creek below and the honey sat golden in her palm, and somewhere across the prairie Jacob was probably feeding his horses and thinking his own thoughts about second chances and about brave women who face down boulders alone until they don't have to anymore. Sarah went inside and started a grocery list for Friday, and she would bring wine and rolls and maybe that apple pie recipe she hadn't made since Thomas died, and she felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest and something that felt remarkably like hope. And she smiled because sometimes "don't stop" means exactly what it sounds like, and sometimes it means "please stay," and sometimes it means "I'm ready to let someone in again," and sometimes kindness is just showing up, and sometimes it's everything, and sometimes the boulder that blocks your path is really just life's way of making sure you're standing in exactly the right spot when the right person rides by.